Tonight on Capitol Journal, new budget estimates show Alabama with a surplus. We'll go over the numbers and speak with lead budget writer Kirk Fulford of the Legislative Services Agency. Lawmakers are revisiting the state's Economic Development Incentives Law. Karen Goldsmith reports, and State Representative Danny Garrett joins us for more analysis. Randy Scott reports on the capital city's efforts to lure new businesses to old parts of town. Michael Staley of the Alabama Clean Fuels Coalition discusses the present and future of electric vehicles in Alabama. And with high school football starting this week, Chad Pilcher joins us to talk a little pigskin under the Friday night lights. It's all next on Capitol Journal. From our State House studio in Montgomery, I'm Todd Stacy. Welcome to Capitol Journal. The latest unemployment numbers were released today. Alabama's jobless rate for July remained at a record low 2.6%. That's down from 3.4% a year ago. The number of people counted as employed reached a record high of 2,232,543, which is an increase of more than 65,000 people over the last year. Counties with the lowest unemployment were Shelby, Marshall, and Coleman counties. Those with the highest rates were Wilcox, Perry, and Lowndes counties. Governor Kay Ivey said the state will continue trying to help connect workers with available jobs and career training opportunities. Alabama's strong economy is being credited for lifting the state's revenues to unprecedented highs. According to Chief Fiscal Officer Kirk Fulford, receipts to the Education Trust Fund are currently more than $9.7 billion, while obligations are only $9.2 billion. That means the state right now has a more than $500 million surplus in the Education Trust Fund, with a month and a half remaining in the fiscal year. The general fund is also beating expectations by about 7.4% and is about $200 million ahead of schedule. The surpluses have lawmakers talking about offering tax relief in the form of rebates during the next legislative session. I'll speak with Mr. Fulford and State Representative Danny Garrett about these budget numbers later in the show. Another task facing lawmakers next session is reauthorizing the state's Economic Development Incentive laws, which are set to expire next year. A special committee met this week to discuss possible revisions to those laws to make Alabama more competitive with other states in the pursuit of major projects. Capitol Journal's Karen Goldsmith has that story.
We wanted to find out how our incentives ranked against other states, and the good news is we have one of the best incentive packages in the country, and we've got to get those reauthorized.
Lieutenant Governor Will Ainsworth leads the Legislative Study Committee on renewing economic development incentives.
We're competing against other states to recruit these industries, and my goal as chair is to have the best incentives package in the Southeast.
So he tapped industry experts, including Alabama's Commerce Secretary Greg Canfield.
We have never desired to have a toolbox of incentives that was able to give the most money away in terms of incentives. We wanted a toolbox that created wealth for the state, that helped raise the level of wage earning capability for Alabama citizens.
He says they also wanted them to be sustainable, profitable, and pay as you go. The two plans up for reauthorization are:
the Growing Alabama credit is really designed about making land available for economic development to attract new investment and to attract the jobs that come with it.
And the Alabama Jobs Act gives companies an infrastructure investment credit and, of course, a jobs credit.
And for every new Alabama job they create, we're going to look at their payroll from the previous 12 months, and we're going to give them an incentive based on a small portion of that payroll.
He says the data shows both plans are generating positive financial outcomes for the state, and he has several recommendations for enhancing both, including removing the annual cap on the Alabama Jobs Act.
We've got a cap that we have in that program of $350 million on an annualized balance, which means, all that means is that when we make a commitment today, we enter into a project agreement, a contract with the company. regarding those incentives. And of course, we count that against the cap. I'm here to say that we are bumping up close to the cap.
Another reason Canfield recommends removing the cap on the Alabama Jobs Act is sometimes businesses don't keep their agreement in their incentive plans, therefore forfeiting the financial incentive. In other words, the money reserved for that business under the cap is never used, and the state does not lose. For Capital Journal, I'm Karen Goldsmith.
The Alabama Workforce and Wage Gap Task Force held its first meeting this week. The group is charged with finding evidence-based policies that address the state's disparity between what men and women are paid for the same jobs. Melanie Bridgeforth of the Women's Foundation of Alabama is the group's chair.
The wage gap for women in Alabama is larger for women in the South and the U.S. overall. So we have the 8th widest wage gap nationally. And at the current rate of change, women in Alabama could expect to see equal pay by 2089. That's a long time, but we know that we can get there a lot sooner. Now, here's the kicker. I love this one, so I really want you to hone in on this. If single women were paid comparable to men in Alabama, we would reduce poverty by half. So, poverty, as you all probably know well, is a choice. It's a policy choice, right? You can address these issues through policy. Wage inequality is a policy choice. There's certainly things that individuals can do, but then there are systems that block individuals from reaching their full potential. And that is what the work of this task force is really centered on. How can we remove those barriers so that all people in Alabama can reach their full potential?
Also on the economic front, the capital city is working to bring new businesses to older parts of town. It's a different approach leaders hope will pay off. Capital Journal's Randy Scott reports.
This is something that's been in the making for quite some time, and I'm glad that we're able to finally get it off the ground.
Montgomery Mayor Stephen Reed is talking about a new program designed to help revitalize west and southern parts of the capital city. The goal is to help the entire city move forward.
We wanted to focus on the I-65 corridor. We wanted to focus on West Montgomery. And then as we started talking last year about areas in South Montgomery, Normandale Shopping Center, Governor's House Hotel, other corridors, 231 Troy Highway that we thought needed intentional development.
The mayor has organized a bus tour from downtown to the areas mentioned. City leaders, business owners, and investors will see places for potential.
It's one thing to have the concept, it's one thing to have the idea, it's one thing to even have the passion and energy. But if you don't have the experts in the room, and you don't have the people who know how to guide us on what needs to be done at a local, state, and federal standpoint, then it just remains that. It remains talk.
They see a region that has one grocery store for hundreds of residents, some businesses, some neighborhoods, but also vacant lots. After the tour, guests such as Lindsay Edwards, an investment officer, say they're optimistic.
I'm a Montgomery, Alabama native, so I know this part of town has been disinvested over time, so it's exciting to see some energy and momentum building. We know that there's a lot of work ahead of us, but overall excited about the opportunities.
District 4 City Councilwoman Audrey Graham says the potential is there.
It's vital to the growth in District 4. It's vital to the growth of the city of Montgomery. At the end of the day, we have business and industries coming, but they need to see us revitalize, and they need to see the city investing in their own community so they'll know it's worth them coming and investing.
For Capital Journal, I'm Randy Scott.
We'll be right back with tonight's guests.
You can watch past episodes of Capital Journal online at video.aptv.org. Capital Journal episodes are also available on APTV's free mobile app. You can also connect with Capital Journal and link to past episodes on Capital Journal's Facebook page. And you can listen to past episodes of Capital Journal when you're driving or on the go with Capital Journal podcasts.
Next, I'm joined by State Representative Danny Garrett, Chairman of the House Education Budget Committee. Mr. Chairman, thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me.
It's good timing because there's news this week. Mary Sell reported, you can always count on Mary for getting the scoop, that the state is looking at a surplus in the Education Trust Fund. Revenue looks really strong. And there's even talk in the upper chamber about maybe some tax rebates that they might want to do. How likely is that from your perspective?
Well, the state is awash in cash. That's what's happened all across the country. Most states are running huge budget surpluses because of all the federal help and assistance from COVID. I saw a slide this week that showed that about 30% of the amount equivalent to 30% of the U.S. GDP was paid by the federal government into COVID relief across, and it's given states access to a lot of cash. So in Alabama, that's close to $60 billion of federal infusion we've had into the state. So yes, we have a lot of cash. We have not spent the last couple of years what we could have spent according to the budget formulas we have. I think that it's likely that we're going to, we absolutely will discuss tax rebates. We're actually looking at our tax structure. We'll be looking at really, from a long-term standpoint, what makes sense. So I think it's something we'll discuss, but also there's a long time between now and March. And with inflation and all of the other uncertainties out there, we're going to have to be very mindful that we don't do something that's permanently going to damage the state down the road. So it's enough money that we're definitely going to be looking at those things.
Yeah, I guess the reason somebody would say rebate, that's a one-time thing, right? As opposed to if you change the tax code, it's permanent, and then, or at least until you change it again,
Right.
and that's what really affects budgets long-term.
Right. So some people believe that we should take the surplus and just rebate it altogether, but that's taking one-time money and affecting your permanent, revenue stream. We just have to be careful that we do what's fiscally prudent, and that's, I think, what we're going to be doing is in both chambers.
Of course, the school year is just getting started. This year, every teacher is getting a pay raise, with larger raises going to those who are with more experience in the classroom. That was in the budget this past year this past session. Have you heard any feedback from educators about that's impact and if it's helped keep teachers in the classroom and recruit new ones?
It's been very, very effective from what I can tell so far. I know for a fact that we had a number of teachers who had already filed retirement papers that were on sort of the end of their careers when they realized that the pay raise was coming and that they were going to benefit from that. They pulled those papers, and so we kept some teachers. We retained teachers. We have a pilot hub trying to get into some areas where we didn't have quality teachers, highly qualified teachers, highly certified teachers for math in one of our rural counties. And I was just told today that program, we're moving to another location because that school was able to hire 2 highly qualified teachers. So it's making a difference. We also have had anecdotally heard stories of teachers who were coming in from other states who were set to move to other states. We're now competitive not only with surrounding states, but what's important for teachers is we're competing with the private sector. And so that's what we've had to adjust the salary matrix for that. But it's already had an impact. And again, the deal is not to get just a body, but a highly qualified person. And we're having some success.
Mm-hmm. Well, I saw that at last week's board meeting, a state school board meeting, Superintendent Mackey made a budget request of about $800 million, I think $799 million additional in the budget to go toward counselors, nurses, and principals. I realize it is very early in the budget process, but is that kind of wish list feasible from a legislative standpoint?
I haven't seen the details of his request or know what he's really talking about in detail. That on the surface seems to be incredibly ambitious to me. Again, always want to see the information, but I think that's a pretty startling number, I guess I would say.
Well, I know you work with the superintendent, you work with people from across the board, but I'm curious when you hear from local folks, whether it's local principals, local superintendents, teachers themselves, what do they say that they really want and need from Montgomery?
Well, I think one thing is that any money we can put into the classroom support, and we've seen more emphasis in the budget strictly on putting funds into the classroom. Obviously, having the pay issues are important. I think security is more and more important, something that we're hearing about. And I think that you're going to see the legislature address the security, make sure our schools are secure. Mental health has become just a problem nationwide in a number of areas, and certainly we hear about that in the schools, and special education, special needs areas of education. So I hear more about the security, the special needs areas, and the mental health aspects. And of course, everybody's concerned about security as a priority.
Mm-hmm. I saw you down at Point Clear for the BCA conference, and I thought it was really interesting how education kept coming up. You saw the majority leader, Nathaniel Ledbetter, bring it up as basically he was asked, "What's the most important issue facing the state?" And he said, "Improving education or fixing education." That was kind of unexpected, out of the blue. Others kind of echoed him. Then, of course, you had Senator Marsh had some really tough words about, I guess, our past performance. My question is, do you sense, is there a new sense of urgency among your colleagues about addressing education? There's been the reading bill, the math bill. Is there a new sense of urgency in this building for improving education?
I think we're all aware of the education gaps we have throughout the state. They don't exist everywhere, but certainly where they exist, they're really pretty dire. And we've not really as a state addressed those on a targeted approach. So we've seen in the last couple of budgets a focus to try to do that. If you look at the Innovation Commission report, which was prepared by Hoover Institution, Stanford University folks were involved in that, Dr. Condoleezza Rice, a lot of very people who are aware of where the economy is going, the transition to knowledge-based economy. They talked about the opportunities that Alabama has, but our number one problem is that education deficiency, that education gap. And one of there were 4 pillars of the Innovation Commission report, but the first pillar and the number one, the priority pillar, was closing the education gap. That's key to us basically creating a workforce in the state, retaining a workforce in the state, attracting people into the state. Particularly into some of these remote areas, people are not going to relocate and live in areas where we don't have good school systems. But I think the education awareness of how important closing that education gap was emphasized in the Innovation Commission report, which is now something Innovation Corporation is looking at, and the legislature is understanding that and sees that. And I think I'm very encouraged by the fact that we're now just not taking our dollars and dividing it by 67 counties according to some formula. We're looking like you would in a business. Where are our problems the most significant, and where do we need direct funding or what other resources to solve problems? So closing the education gap is very, very critical, and there are a number of ways to do that. Financially, other ways, other options, and we're going to be looking at all of those in the years to come.
You mentioned the Innovation Commission, and that kind of feeds into my next question, because I know, this week we had the committee, task force, looking at economic development incentives and the future of incentives, because this next year is going to be the Alabama Jobs Act reauthorization, right? So you see it kind of both ways, from the legislative revenue standpoint and from the innovation economic standpoint. So let me just ask you, have our incentive programs, economic incentives programs, have they been successful?
I think when you look at the number of manufacturers we have, the automobile manufacturing we have in the state, when you look at the aerospace growth and a number of other manufacturing areas, you can see that I think they have been effective and have been successful. As we transition to a knowledge-based economy, though, those incentives are going to have to account for where the economy is going. What type of economy do we want to have, business do we have in the future to complement that economy? And even the current manufacturing operations are going to change with robotics and other type of technology will change that. So I think that, yes, they've been effective. I think we need to have more transparency on really the details, and the public needs to be aware, and the legislators need to be aware, quite frankly, more of how the specifics. But I can tell you that, yes, they've been effective, but what we've done in the past is not necessarily going to be effective for us in the future as the economy transitions to knowledge-based and more technology. So we need more transparency. We need to be looking at these things very carefully and doing what we can to foster the growth in numerous segments of economic development.
Well, I suppose that's one big reason why it requires reauthorization, right? I guess the last time was 2018. So I guess it's an every 5-year sort of thing. Does that give the legislature the opportunity to say, and this task force, the opportunity to say, all right, if we tweak this and tweak this, and we've learned over the last 5 years how the economy's changed. Now we can do it differently?
In the past several years, the legislature, I think, has gotten very, very good at becoming more responsible and fiscally responsible about some of the decisions we've made. And one of the things we've done is basically make sure that any tax incentive that comes through that's approved has a sunset, because we need to evaluate after 4 or 5 years, is this working? Is it creating the jobs we thought it would create? Is it something that's really worth the taxpayers and support? And so every credit that's passed will have these sunset provisions. That gives us an opportunity to review it. We have 2 up now, the Growing Alabama and Jobs Act. That's very, very important. Those have been very, very important to the growth up to now. But I think we need to kind of expand that look and make sure that we're getting the bang for our buck for these incentives.
Just thinking, you go back 30 years to Mercedes, and that number kind of raised a lot of eyebrows. But you won't find a whole lot of people that don't think that was a pretty good investment, considering everything that has happened in its wake.
That was really the turning point, or the linchpin for really the economic development in the state. I think that was the first time we really had something that significant come to the state. And it's been sort of a model for what we've done in other places. But now we need to expand that again to the technology areas, to the small business areas, to different types of businesses other than just traditional manufacturing. All of those are important. But again, where's the market going? Where is the economy going? We want to play along with that. And particularly with these automobile manufacturers, as they transition to electric vehicle production or things like that, what do we need to do to make sure they stay here and don't move somewhere else? You've got to be, but we've also adopted the philosophy of pay as you go. We're not going to basically give these incentives up front. You earn these incentives because you perform based upon a plan. And the legislature's been pretty good at holding people's feet to the fire lately, so I'm encouraged by that. And this commission is basically looking at all of these and trying to make some good decisions as far as these 2 credits, and also looking at a bunch of other credits as well, and seeing what other type of things we need to be considering.
Well, we will be paying attention going forward. Mr. Chairman, thanks again for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me.
We'll be right back.
You're watching Alabama Public Television.
Next, I'm joined by Kirk Fulford, Deputy Director of the Legislative Services Agency. Kirk, thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me.
Now, you are the budget leader, really, for the Legislative Services Agency, the lead budget guy here in the State House. Tell our audience, and our audience sees you a lot on via our stories, but tell us more about what you do and about Legislative Services Agency.
Okay, thank you. I'm actually serving in a role of the Legislative Fiscal Officer, which means that I do revenue estimates. Our office does revenue estimates as well as drafting the budget for the legislature. We are responsible for calculating the cap, or the amount of money that we can spend in the Education Trust Fund every year. So basically all things budget and money that the legislature deals with, our office has a hand in.
Now, it used to be the old Legislative Fiscal Office, and they combined that with the Legislative Research Services to combine it into LSA.
Yes.
When did that happen?
It happened officially in 2017. We were informally doing that a couple of years prior. Seems to have worked seamlessly. We have a great working relationship upstairs, and we still do what we've traditionally done as far as the money and the budgets and stuff. The legal division still drafts bills. We just all kind of work together now, as opposed to being standalone offices.
And observers of the legislature will hear or see when the legislature's in session talk of a fiscal note. You got a bill and it does something with money, it's going to have a fiscal note attached. That's when they come to you. How does that process work?
Yeah, so every general bill that comes out of committee is required to have a fiscal note attached to it. And what the fiscal note is just an estimate of the overall fiscal impact of that bill on state budgets, any individual fund or any individual agency. We have to do that on, like I said, on every general bill. We don't do it on local bills. The rules don't require us to do that, but it's a real time-consuming process, and something that we've got our analysts working on from the time the legislative session starts until it ends.
So, some lawmaker drops a bill. it may seem innocuous, but y'all have got to do research into, okay, what's the economic impact going to be on the whatever agency or fund. Sometimes it's zero, but you've got to figure that out so that and it travels along with the bill, right?
That's right, and it also gets changed. Anytime there's an amendment or a substitute to that bill, we have to adjust the fiscal note for any changes relative to the numbers attached to the bill. So yeah, it's a cumbersome process, but it's something that our analysts get into, and they do a really good job of producing the numbers in a short time period most of the time. So I'm proud of the work that they do.
Sounds like y'all stay pretty busy during the session.
We do.
So you created quite a stir last week with your presentation. This is the latest presentation on the budgets in that budget hearing, when you revealed basically that the state budgets are in surplus. And can you walk me through those numbers as they are right now in the Education Trust Fund and the General Fund?
Yeah. So on the Education Trust Fund, it's bigger than on the General Fund. So the Education Trust Fund has obligations right now of a little over $9 billion. Now that includes supplemental appropriations as well as the regular budget for the current fiscal year. We right now have available revenues of almost $9.7 billion. So we have more revenue right now than we needed to fund the budget on the Education Trust Fund side. On the General Fund side, it's a similar situation. We have $2.9 billion in obligations. We have about $2.75 billion in revenues with, based on what we got last year over the last couple of months, we're still about $280 million ahead of what we need to fund the remaining portions of the budget. So it's an odd situation, to be honest with you. I've been around for almost 26 years. We actually experienced quite a dramatic drop-off with the COVID pandemic, and in years past, what that would have meant is we'd be sitting here talking about who got cut and how much they got cut. So changes that were made after the last recession really put the state's budgets in position to be able to weather that storm and actually be prepared to handle another storm if it comes up in the near future, as some are expecting.
Now, I mean, you mentioned those numbers, which are just really jarring. But the fiscal year is not finished yet, right?
That's right.
We've got until the end of September, so there's more revenue coming in.
There's more revenue coming in, that's right.
Wow. Well, there's been talk about what to do with this surplus. Mm-hmm. Here in the legislature, they've been talking about tax rebates, things like that. But let me ask you, let's just say nothing happens to that money. Where does it go? Does it roll over into next year's budget?
Yeah, so under the Rolling Reserve Act, if we had appropriated to the cap, the Rolling Reserve Act cap, it would be a waterfall approach to where some would go into a savings account and some would go into another fund that could be appropriated later. We did not spend to the cap in the current fiscal year, which means that on the ETF side and on the general fund side, the money would basically just become the beginning balance for the fiscal year 2023 that begins in October. Unobligated, unspent, and unaccounted for in terms of what was budgeted for that fiscal year.
Hence the talk of tax rebates and things like that. Well, it's been a few years, but you talked about the simplified sales and use tax, basically enforcing sales tax online, right?
Right.
I guess that was implemented in 2015.
2015, we passed an act to make it voluntary at that time, and then the Wayfair case came about, and no longer was voluntary; it was mandatory. We went from not collecting any revenue on that in 2015 until right now. The general fund is seeing $192 million right now, year to date, and the Education Trust Fund has received $64 million of that. Total collections on it are over $500 million. Half of the money goes to the local governments, half of it comes to the state, and the general fund gets 75% of that revenue that the state keeps. That was one of the changes that was implemented after the last recession that provided a growth revenue for the general fund. Last year the revenue source grew by about 40%, and this year it's growing by about a 20% clip, so it's still growing. It's not growing by as much as it was last year, but that's to be understood.
Last year being the COVID online purchases. I mean, I was doing it. I was on Amazon.
That's right.
But that's a significant revenue increase for the general fund, which really over the years has struggled in terms of generating growth revenue.
Right. Traditionally, the general fund has, and prior to 2010, we looked under every rock we could look under to try to scrape together enough money to fund a budget. Like I said, since the Great Recession, there were structural changes made. We reallocated some regular use tax money to the general fund, and then we implemented the simplified seller's use tax, which is just a godsend for the general fund in terms of an ongoing, reliable, growing revenue source that has gone from zero in 2015 to the third largest revenue source of the general fund in just a short period of time.
Mm-hmm. And can you briefly explain, I mean, I think most viewers understand we have two different budgets, the Education Trust Fund and the General Fund. A lot of states just have one.
That's right.
It was implemented probably 40, 50 years ago.
And Education Trust Fund came about in actually the late 20s.
Oh, really? Okay.
It's been around a while.
Can you walk our viewers through kind of how that works with two different budgets that the legislature has to pass every year?
Yeah, so as you indicated, we're one of only 3 states that have 2 separate budgets. We're also one of only 4 states that have an October to September fiscal year, so we're kind of different in that regard. It is important to know that most of sales tax and all of income taxes go to the Education Trust Fund. So anytime there's an issue that pops up with regard to the economy in terms of a growing economy, expedited receipts, you're going to see it real quickly in the Education Trust Fund, because that's just, obviously the easiest revenue sources to point to. But, counter to that, anytime there's a slowdown, you absolutely can see it as well. So those are the things we have to watch out for on the Education Trust Fund side. On the General Fund, it's kind of a hodgepodge of about 40 different revenue sources that compile the General Fund. $2.6 billion in actual revenues last year. Biggest one of those is insurance company license and premium taxes, a little over $300 million, but everything else, it's kind of like everything in the kitchen sink is thrown into the General Fund that doesn't go to the Education Trust Fund. Like I said, 93% of the revenue in the Education Trust Fund is income and sales. There's total 10 revenue sources, but 93% of it, of the total $8.6 billion we collected last year, was income and sales.
Which fluctuates quite a bit with the economy. And speaking of the economy, look, it just seems like it's really humming right now in the state. But some have, I guess you described it as a sugar high.
Yeah.
Based on all this federal money, not just that's been put into the budgets here like ARPA, but
right.
Just floating around in the economy that filters down. Are you concerned at all about that going away and leading to a recession? And if so, what kind of effect would that have on state budgets?
Yeah, it's always a concern. I monitor those things every day. There's a new article that comes out about, are we in a recession, are we not in a recession? We had 2 consecutive negative GDP growth quarters at the U.S. level, and most people consider that to be a recession. Well, the economists that I've talked to at the national level in various meetings I've attended are reluctant to go there right now, simply because the labor market is telling you a different story. Not unlike Alabama's labor market. We've got the lowest unemployment we've ever had. We've got the largest number of people we've ever had working, historical in that regard. And you can also see that in withholdings tax payments, which is what I look at in terms of seeing the strength of the economy, strength of the labor market, because those taxes are withheld from people's paychecks. So,
and you mentioned that in the last budget meeting. What exactly do you mean by withholdings?
It's the taxes that are withheld from an individual's checks, on a weekly or whatever cycle they're on. And then that's submitted to the state on a quarterly basis, depending on the size of the business, sometimes a monthly basis. So it's normally, and since the Great Recession, that number has grown a little less than 4%. I always say if it's growing by more than 4%, the Education Trust Fund's going well. And I say that because the individual income tax is the largest individual portion of the Education Trust Fund, and the largest portion of that is withholdings taxes. It's about 70% of total individual income tax receipts comes from withholdings taxes. So if that's growing by more than 4%, in most cases it tells me the Education Trust Fund's doing well.
Where is it now? Okay.
At the end of July, it was over 10%.
Wow.
Yeah.
So more than double what you consider good.
And last year was over 7%. So it's picked up even from where it was last year. So it's a real indication of where we are in terms of our labor market. Now, does that mean that there's any less impact in terms of inflation? There's not. I mean, you and I know you go to the grocery store and you can buy very few things and leave the store and pay way more than you paid a year ago. And so that's something we certainly are watching. It's certainly something that our individual taxpayers and citizens are seeing, and something that we have to watch because every one of our agencies buy items, right? We got corrections that has to buy food for the inmates. We've got lots of capital projects ongoing, and the cost of those materials and supplies related to those capital projects has gone up. And transportation cost and everything that agencies have to deal with has gone up. So it's a matter of the cost of them doing business has increased. Now, have we provided them enough money to be able to cover that cost? Hopefully so. But, it's absolutely something that we're watching and paying attention to. Can we adjust? Yes. Like I said, we made structural changes, the legislature made structural changes after the last recession that put us in a much better footing in both the general fund as well as the education trust fund to be able to weather a storm, a slowdown, a recession. And coupled with the fact that the budgets that have been passed over the past few years have been conservative in nature, we didn't spend everything that we could have spent with regard to our revenue estimates, and left money on the table because there was so much uncertainty in the economy. What's going to happen coming out of COVID? Remember I said that our fiscal year is October to September. Well, the impact of COVID started about 6 months into our fiscal year. Some states had to push revenue sources from their one fiscal year into the next because the federal government changed the filing date on income taxes. We didn't have to do that. So we actually saw a reduction in 2020 versus a decline in 2020 that most other states did. And then, we accessed some money that we had in a reserve fund to try to weather a cash flow situation. We didn't have to cut the budget, unlike some of our surrounding states. And certainly feel more comfortable about it now than we've ever felt in terms of being able to handle something like that in the future.
Well, we will be watching as the legislative session is about 6 months away.
Yeah.
So we'll be watching the budget numbers. Kirk, thanks again for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me.
We'll be right back.
You can watch past episodes of Capitol Journal online anytime at Alabama Public Television's website, aptv.org. Click on the Online Video tab on the main page. You can also connect with Capitol Journal and link to past episodes on Capitol Journal's Facebook page.
Electric vehicles are more popular and available than ever before. And joining me now to talk about it is Michael Staley, president of the Alabama Clean Fuels Coalition. Michael, thanks for coming on Capitol Journal.
Well, thanks for having me.
Well, can you tell us more about the Clean Fuels Coalition and what your organization does for the state?
Yeah, so we're a nonprofit organization. We're based in Birmingham. We have a statewide footprint, and we work to implement and educate about alternative fuels in the transportation sector. So we are primarily focused on fuels that are alternatives to petroleum that can be implemented in a cost-effective way for businesses, and with EVs, particularly for consumers.
Well, yeah, and obviously electric vehicles, that's kind of just really grown in popularity these days. You see commercials for them. It's really become popular. Why is the electric vehicle use, the market, the industry, why is that important, particularly in Alabama?
Well, I would say for Alabama, first, EVs are important for communities. And, going back to one of my favorite movies, Field of Dreams, if you build it, they will come. And communities need to install electric vehicle charging that's publicly accessible if they want to attract EV drivers who are traveling. And the reason is because if people are stopping to fuel or rest and they can charge their car, they're going to spend money, and that leaves money behind in our communities. So that's the one reason. And the second reason it's really important for our state is because we're the number 4 auto exporting state in the country. And you can start by looking at our existing industry. Mercedes is producing EVs. They're making batteries in Bibb in Tuscaloosa County. Alabama Graphite Products is going to be producing graphite for batteries in Coosa County. The first graphite produced in North America is going to be in Coosa County. We have in Birmingham, Autocar making electric garbage trucks, designing them there. And then in Anniston, New Flyer is making transit buses that are, their biggest competition is in China. And they're making transit buses that are electric in Anniston, Alabama, and sending them around the country and the world. So our automotive industry and our state economy really is going to be the automobile manufacturing of the future. In addition to that, just one more thing is the AMP Center in Tuscaloosa. We're going to have some of the most advanced research and development coming right out of Tuscaloosa with that partnership, the AMP Center at Tuscaloosa.
Well, it sounds like we are in the EV business. It's funny because they were talking about this at the incentives committee meeting that happened this week about, what are we going to be economically incenting for the next future. But you're right. Mercedes has bet on Alabama in terms of producing batteries here. That's really interesting. Well, when it comes, we're here in the State House. We like to talk about state policy. What on the state level has happened or needs to happen in order to support the EV industry in Alabama?
Well, there's a lot of talk and you can read a lot of things, but one thing our legislature is doing is being really smart about how they approach this. So the federal government is going to be sending a lot of money for charging infrastructure along interstates. And we know that in Alabama, there's a lot of communities that are nowhere near an interstate.
Sure.
And in order for them to get those opportunities, Alabama has a grant program that will complement that federal program and make opportunities for communities that aren't on the interstate to have charging infrastructure so that 10 years down the road, at least they got started now and they can build that out themselves. But to have that seed to get started is what the state is doing and investing in that infrastructure. And that's for businesses in our state. That's for gas station owners, that's for hotel owners, that's for RV park operators, that's for anyone, restaurants, retail establishments. So the EV chargers can go almost anywhere. So it changes the paradigm of how you think about fueling a vehicle.
And so a business goes about, they'll apply either to the state or the federal government for one of these grants?
Well, yeah, so in both cases, the state of Alabama will administer the federal funds in one program, and then they have a state program, and people will apply. You can go to ADECA's website and look at the electric vehicle infrastructure program, and you can also read the state's electric vehicle infrastructure plan, and it gives a really great, thorough understanding of where the demand is expected to be, and also places we want to make sure we don't leave behind.
Right, because it's all about those charging stations, and we'll put up a map of that too, because there are different types of charging stations, right? There's like a really quick, rapid charge. There's a slower charge and so maybe we're moving toward more of these rapid chargers.
Well, 80 to 90% of people that charge an EV do it at home in your garage overnight, and you actually spend probably less than a third on fuel that you would for gasoline charging at home. It's when you go outside your normal range, when you go on a trip, when you travel, or if you live in a place where you can't put a charger in your garage or you need to go somewhere public. So you have these publicly available chargers that you pay to use, and those are critical. That's the biggest barrier to EV adoption because, range anxiety, the fear that the car can't make it where you're going, that's really a thing of the past. The first EVs had really short ranges. The new models coming out today, they've got plenty of range. It's just when I drive my family down to New Orleans, to see my wife's family, we want to make sure that if I'm driving my new electric pickup truck that I've ordered, that I can stop and charge somewhere along the way. And Alabama, I believe this is an area where we should be proud of what the state's doing and preparing, and not over preparing just right.
I can just imagine those travelers to the beach, right? They're looking for, maybe where they can charge. I know that Congress has done some things recently. There was this infrastructure law. There was this bill that was just signed last week about that had some climate things in it. How was the work from the federal government, from Congress specifically, and its impact on the electric vehicle market?
Well, just like with anything, when Congress passes a law, that impacts the planning for businesses and, manufacturing and everything. So there's a huge impact from policy, and consistency is important. And so there's some tax provisions that have changed in recent law, and how that actually impacts the bottom line for the EV market is to be determined. But overarching, the fact remains that EVs are powered by 100% domestically produced electricity. That's energy independence. And also, Congress and the federal government, as I said, they're investing in the seed money to develop a national network of chargers, and that's a good thing, to get that started. And it's really great that Alabama is complementing that, making sure that it's not just the interstates where we have the opportunities.
When the conversation about electric vehicles comes up, especially in context with high gas prices, you hear a lot about sticker shock, saying these aren't necessarily what the mainstream consumer can afford. What would you say to somebody with that argument?
Well, look, Todd, I was talking to someone yesterday. They're waiting to take delivery of a Ford F-150. It's a four-door crew cab, I call it crew cab, pickup truck that looks just like any other four-door truck. And it was a base price of $40,000. They added on $8,000 for, some additional features. But the point is, that's not far from what you would expect to pay for a four-door pickup truck. And the point I'm making is the perceptions that people have that an EV looks like a clown car, it's not something I want to drive, and I can't afford it anyways, that should, really be a thing of the past. And people should take a close look at the models that are available and the prices. Both two things are happening. That price parity is coming, where the gasoline-powered car and the EV car are going to be basically the same price. And especially when you look at the life cycle cost, you're going to save money with a lot of the EV models. And over time, the time it takes to charge the cars when you're on a trip is going to reach parity with a gas station filling up a car with gas. And that's when it's going to really just pop.
While I have you, I know that there's this electric vehicle summit happening in Birmingham there at the BJCC next month. Governor Ivey's going to be there, industry leaders. How do folks find out more about this and maybe even register if they want to come?
Sure. Well, driveelectric.alabama.gov. That's where to go to check it out. And you can find a place to read the program and register. But the EV Summit is a way to bring together all those businesses we've already talked about, all those counties and the cities and the folks that are saying, how do we prepare for this, and where do we get the money? How do we apply for a grant? What grants are available? And they're going to start this EV Summit September 21st and 22nd at the BJCC in Birmingham. driveelectric.alabama.gov. Go there, register. It's not expensive to sign up, and you'll learn a lot from why is it important for our state, what are our manufacturers doing, what do the electric utilities think about all this, and also where do you get the money to get the grants to have those chargers in your community and be one of the first ones to do it.
Well, Michael, this has reminded me of our old days in D.C. So I really appreciate you coming on Capitol Journal.
Well, it's great to be here in Montgomery with you. Thank you, Todd.
We'll be right back.
You can watch past episodes of Capitol Journal online at video.aptv.org. Capitol Journal episodes are also available on APTV's free mobile app. You can also connect with Capitol Journal and link to past episodes on Capitol Journal's Facebook page. And you can listen to past episodes of Capitol Journal when you're driving or on the go with Capitol Journal podcasts.
A little something different this week. It's the start of high school football around the state of Alabama. And joining me now is Chad Pilcher, who, in addition to being an attorney for Balch and Bingham, also is a stadium announcer and network announcer for high school teams. And you've done some college work, too.
I have, and it's really been a great opportunity to stay involved in the game of football, which I was fortunate enough to play both in high school and college. And when I was in law school, I found an interest in broadcasting football games, reached out to some folks, started and got involved there. Then when I moved to Alabama, got involved with Hoover High School, was able to do that for a little while, have called some games for Stanford University and UAB, and then this year transitioning to Vestavia Hills High School to start calling their games. We've got a brand new head coach in Robert Evans, brand new athletic director, so it's an exciting time there, and they crank off the season this weekend against Mountain Brook.
It's kind of crazy that, high school football games are broadcast. Some colleges years ago weren't even broadcast.
No, it's really transformed, and you see as the game of football grows, not only at the college and professional level, but it's trickled down to the high school level as well. And what you're really seeing is a lot of guys who are really good broadcasters are getting involved at the high school level. I think the level and the quality of the high school broadcasts have really grown up over the past several years, so it's really neat to be involved with that.
I'm sure. Well, it really is quite the pastime here in Alabama. High school football, Friday night lights, not just for the athletes themselves and coaches and everything, but for the community. This is where communities gather. So let's just look at some of the statewide trends going on. I mean, look, I don't watch every game, but I know enough to know that Thompson High School there in Alabaster is really the big gorilla in the room, right?
And when you're talking about high school football in Alabama right now, it's Thompson High School. Head coach Mark Freeman came in several years back, and what he has built is really incredible. And you hear a lot of times, well, how did they get to that level? And I think it's just him and the way he's implemented this program, the way he's really grown it up. You get the entire community to buy in, as you talked about, and he's really had success everywhere that he's gone. He's won championships in the past, but the level at which they are competing right now is really something we haven't seen in a while. We've obviously had Hoover most recently has kind of been that dynasty. Prattville had a great run as well during that time frame, which you're very familiar with.
I went to Prattville. Yeah, I mean, I think they won a couple in a row. Hoover was really the story. They had their own MTV show.
They did. It was incredible what that was back then. That was something no one had ever seen. But now what, again, Thompson's doing, they're going for their 4th straight state championship, and it's when they've won them. They had a very close, really wild game against Auburn a couple of years back, but this year against Central Phoenix City in the championship, the way that they won, they just won it going away, and so they've really become the dominant program in the state of Alabama.
Let's look at some of the other classifications. I guess they're in 5A. You've got Clay Chalkville. It's got a pretty good dynasty of their own.
Yeah, Clay Chalkville, they've won 15 games in a row. That's the longest winning streak in the state right now. And then here locally, Pike Road, they've won the state championship. They're going to bump up a year in classification this year. And that's one thing you've seen. You have some schools every 2 years, the AHSA redoes their classification. So you see these teams moving up and down. And so obviously if you move up, that's a little more difficult, right? It's larger schools. And then just all the movement among the coaches that we've seen. And that's something, I guess it's always happened, but it seems like it's really happened a lot these last few years, just the way all the different coaches and big name coaches. Just one game this weekend that's going to kick off. It's Gulf Shores versus St. Michael. Gulf Shores coached by Mark Hudspeth, who had been a head coach at Louisiana Lafayette. He had been a coach at Mississippi State. St. Michael coached by Phillip Rivers, who's a Hall of Fame quarterback who's going to be coaching. So that's a game you're going to see this weekend in high school football in Alabama, and that to me is really indicative of just how good the sport is, how important the sport is here in the state.
Well, yeah, I was going to ask you about especially the coaches, the facilities. I mean, it's almost like these, especially the big high schools, have become miniature colleges. Yeah. I think about, like you said, I went to Prattville, and we always had a pretty good football program, and they had a lot of success after my days. But every time we'd get a good coach and he'd win a championship, somebody'd come pick him off with a big paycheck, more money. Same thing with like facilities. You're seeing these big practice facilities, big stadium improvements. I mean, it's really kind of becoming a miniature college, which is kind of crazy to think about.
It is, and these communities are investing. Obviously, schools get X number of dollars from the state, but then those local dollars come in, and how much are they willing to invest? And a lot of schools find it important. I mean, I think you see that community pride that high school football really develops, high school sports as a whole, but especially football, just the way that it's set on a Friday night, the way that communities can come together. And you're right, the stadiums, not only the stadiums, but the locker rooms. A lot of schools have practice facilities now. Yeah. I mean, indoor practice facilities that they're using, and that's not uncommon at the 7A level. I mean, if you look at 7A athletics across the state, a lot of those schools have those indoor facilities, and they're just getting better and building more and better facilities every year.
Now, there's one kind of top recruit that people are talking about, because that's another thing about high school football is you're always looking for the ones that are going to go on to the next level. Right. Who might we see it play at Alabama or Auburn? And Earl Woods, he's out of Hueytown.
That's right.
One of the top players in the state. What's his story?
And that's how you know high school football is here and how it's grown so much. You have articles that are written, who's going to be Mr. Football coming up this year in the preseason. And I think Earl Woods is a guy that really stands out. He's a quarterback at Hueytown, had a great season last year where they were the runner-up to the state championship, and now he comes back just with a lot of expectations. Outstanding athlete for a program that's had really good success. Obviously, you think of Hueytown, you go back to Jameis Winston and what he did there. Yeah. So it's a good program and an outstanding player. And when you look at the state of Alabama, college coaches are flocking here. Obviously, Auburn, Alabama, that grates up a lot of the attention. But if you look up and down the board, the level and the number of recruits that go to just different programs, both big and small, it really is very impressive when you talk about all the outstanding high school football players in the state.
Of course, there's always a political angle around here. This is Capital Journal after all. And as we have talked about, Friday night football really brings the hometown together. Well, that's also an opportunity for the politicians, right? We're in an election year.
Right.
So whether you're a current state legislator seeking re-election or maybe running for office for the first time, maybe no better place than the Friday night football game to really see such a huge swath of the town.
It actually adds an extra level of excitement, honestly, to high school football in election years, because you see so many candidates out in front of the stadium passing out flyers, walking around wearing their campaign t-shirts, and I think it becomes just something extra because a large number of people in your community, most of them likely voters, are going to be at that high school football game, and so it is not uncommon at all to see candidates, current office holders, standing both outside and inside the stadium talking to their constituents.
Sure. Oh, look, everybody that's worked in politics has done the Friday night football games, or what's worse than that is the Saturday morning games, or Saturday, in August, where you're handing out stuff. So very common sight. Well, Chad, I've enjoyed this. A little breath of fresh air for our normal political talk, but actually tonight begins the Friday night football season. So thanks for coming and explaining some of this.
Absolutely. Great to be here.
All right. We'll be right back.
You can watch past episodes of Capital Journal online anytime at Alabama Public Television's website, aptv.org. Click on the Online Video tab on the main page. You can also connect with Capital Journal and link to past episodes on Capital Journal's Facebook page.
That's our show for tonight. Thanks for watching. Randy Scott takes the chair as your host next week as I take a few days off. That'll be Friday night, 7:30, right here on Alabama Public Television. For our Capital Journal team, I'm Todd Stacy. We'll see you next time.